Did you know that there are more than 230 references in the New Testament regarding the law? This is not a small concept. In fact, it is one of the most debated and repeated themes in all the letters of Paul. So, when you think of the law, what first comes to your mind? Something good? Something bad? Or something not really clear because you're not even sure what it is? Let me first define how the Apostle Paul used the term. By law, I mean the compilation of all the moral laws and decrees found in the first books of Moses, what we usually call the Torah. But to a larger extent, it is everything that is contained in the Old Testament, particularly when it concerns biblical feasts, customs, and anything that is still applied in the Jewish world today. So how does the Bible view the law? Of course, the Old Testament presents the Torah as being the very best thing that has ever happened to Israel. For instance, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 8, "And what other nation is so great as to have such righteous decrees and laws as this body of laws I'm setting before you today?" But of course, the verse that summarizes it all is in Psalm chapter 19, verse 7. "The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul." Now, what does the New Testament say? Well, in essence, the New Testament says that the law is good, holy, righteous, wise, true, and spiritual. Let me issue a few of the corresponding verses. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "We know that the law is good if one uses it properly." In Romans chapter 7, verse 12, it says, "So then the law is holy, and the commandment is holy, righteous, and good." In Romans chapter 2, verse 20, it says, "In the law is the embodiment of knowledge and truth." In Romans chapter 7, verse 14, it says that the law is spiritual. And now, of course, you have all heard of 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 to 17. All scriptures equip us for every good work, and of course you immediately think that it is the whole Bible. Well, stop just for a second. The New Testament didn't even exist back then. When Paul meant all scriptures, it can only mean one thing and one thing alone: the Tanakh, the Torah, the law. In other words, read this verse differently. The Torah, that is the law, equip us for every good work. Let us see another verses that the New Testament says that the law fits our deepest human aspiration to practice what is right. Romans chapter 7, verse 22. "For in my inner being I delight in God's law." The New Testament says that the law is perfect because its ultimate expression is in love. In Galatians chapter 5, verse 14, he says, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself." Finally, the New Testament says that the law is not abolished, but perfectly exemplified in Christ. In Romans chapter 10, verse 4, it says that Christ is the culmination of the law. Now, in light of everything positive that Paul wrote about the law, we should not be surprised that he lived out the law to its fullest. Look with me at the following examples. In Acts chapter 17, verse 2, we see that he kept the Shabbat and therefore attended the synagogue service as it was his regular habit. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, he observed the Passover feast, and this is why he called the believers in Corinth to all celebrate it. Yes, read it yourself in context. Paul said, "Let us keep the feast." In Acts chapter 20, verse 6, we see that Paul celebrated the feast of unleavened bread. In Acts chapter 20, verse 16, we see that he made every effort to go to Jerusalem in order to celebrate Shavuot, because that was a specific command addressed to all Jews to celebrate Pentecost, Shavuot, in Jerusalem. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 8, when it was not even possible to celebrate Pentecost in Jerusalem, he did it in Corinth. In Acts chapter 27, verse 9, we might even see that Paul kept Yom Kippur. In Acts chapter 16, verse 3, he circumcised Timothy because of the Jews around. In Acts 18, in Acts 21, he did the Nazarite vows 2 times, which was not drinking wine and cutting his hair. In Acts 21, he underwent 7 days of purification rituals and even paid for the vows of others, which was a very expensive act of devotion to the temple. In Acts 21, he did everything to prove that he was following the law because some people had doubts about it. All the examples I just gave should be enough to show you that Paul lived strictly according to the law. In fact, he repeatedly said at least 6 times in the book of Acts that he had never done anything wrong against the Jewish law, against Jewish customs, or against the temple. He was so blameless in the way he lived his Jewish lifestyle that when he appeared before the Sanhedrin in Acts 23, he could confidently declare that until that very day, he had fulfilled his duty before God in all good conscience. If that was not the case, he could have never dared to make such a bold claim to people actually who were looking for every possible way to accuse him. In other words, Paul kept on living like a Jew even after he believed in Jesus. And the same actually can be said of every other Jewish believer in the first century. Just look with me in Acts chapter 21, verse 20. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law." This deep Jewish influence permeated the whole culture and the DNA of the early church. Unfortunately, we know from history that as the non-Jews grew in numbers and powers, they did the very thing that Paul had warned them against. Unfortunately, they became arrogant toward the Jews, and progressively they cut themselves from their original Jewish roots. They didn't just systematically eliminate every possible trace of Jewish influence, which they replaced with pagan influences. They did the absolutely unthinkable. They even became openly hostile to the Jews. Today, after 2,000 years of mutual rejection, God has done his own unthinkable. Jews are coming back to the land, and many are finding their Messiah. As a result, more and more Christians are learning from them, and they're making the startling discovery that we can view the law positively. Now, it is my hope that you too will embark on this journey and be enriched in your own faith.